He called the cops on a veteran, then froze when the officer walked in. The bell above the door gave a sharp jingle as Samuel pushed it open. He stepped inside, the scent of fried bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. The place was a classic: checkered floors, worn-out booths, a counter lined with faded bar stools. It had probably been around for decades, the kind of spot where regulars had their names engraved into the rhythm of the morning rush. He adjusted his army cap, the embroidered golden eagle glinting slightly under the fluorescent lights. His knees ached from the long walk from the clinic, but he was used to the pain. At 74, he carried a history that most wouldn't understand just by looking at him. He spotted an empty table by the window and made his way over, setting his cane against the side of the booth. Outside, the sun hung low, catching the edges of parked cars and the peeling paint on the old hardware store across the street. Behind the counter, a young waiter, Evan, watched him. His grip on the coffee pot tightened as he took in the man's dark skin, his military hat, the slow, steady way he moved. He barely masked the flicker of disapproval in his eyes before walking over. "Can I help you?" His tone was clipped, impatient. Samuel gave him a polite nod. "I'll take a coffee. Black, and the breakfast special if you've got it." Evan didn't write anything down. Instead, he crossed his arms, shifting his weight onto one leg. "We're full." Samuel blinked, glancing around. A couple at the far end was finishing their meal. 2 booths sat completely empty. The counter had a few open spots. "Doesn't seem too full to me," he said evenly. Evan exhaled sharply through his nose. "We're not serving right now." Samuel's fingers drummed lightly against the table. He'd seen this before, years ago, in places where he wasn't welcome. Back then, signs had spelled it out. Now it was hidden behind fake smiles and flimsy excuses. He met the waiter's gaze, steady. "I served this country. I earned the right to sit here and have a meal." Evan's expression hardened. "I don't make the rules." The diner had quieted. A few heads turned, conversations pausing just long enough to pick up the tension in the air. An older man near the counter furrowed his brow but said nothing. Samuel had spent his life choosing his battles, but he was too old to let people like this push him aside. He leaned back slightly. "I'll wait." Evan's patience had run out. He turned on his heel, marching toward the phone near the register. He picked it up and without hesitation dialed. "Yeah, I need an officer at Ricky's diner," he said, voice sharp. "There's a man here causing a disturbance. He won't leave." Samuel didn't move. He just watched him, the weight of history pressing against him once again. But something told him this time would be different. Samuel let out a slow breath, his fingers wrapping around the handle of his coffee cup. Empty, still untouched. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this kind of thing before, wrapped in different words, hidden behind fake rules. It had been decades since the first time someone told him he didn't belong, but the sting never fully faded. From the counter, Evan kept his back turned, the phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, he's still here," he said, voice low but firm. "He's making me uncomfortable. He's refusing to leave." Samuel glanced down at his hands, weathered with time and work. They had once held rifles in the scorching heat of the desert. They had patched up bleeding soldiers in the dead of night. They had built a life after war, even when the country he fought for didn't always fight for him. And now those same hands were being labeled as a threat without a single move on his part. He shifted slightly in his seat, catching the eye of a woman sitting at the far end of the diner. She looked away quickly, focusing on her half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs. Across the room, a man in a trucker's cap nudged his buddy, whispering something. Others simply kept eating, unwilling to get involved. Evan hung up and turned back, his eyes flicking to Samuel like he was already a problem solved. "They're on their way," he said, smirking slightly. "You should probably just go before they get here." Samuel didn't move. "I fought for this country," he said, voice calm but firm. "The same one you live in." Evan scoffed. "That doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want." The words sat heavy in the air. He had heard them before, on battlefields, in government offices, in quiet conversations where people thought he wasn't listening. The diner had gone silent now. Even the sizzling of the griddle behind the counter seemed distant. A deep voice broke the stillness. "You sure about that, son?" It came from the older man at the counter, the one who had been quietly sipping his coffee while all of this unfolded. He set his mug down and turned slightly in his stool. His face was lined with years, his eyes sharp with something Evan clearly hadn't expected: disapproval. Evan's jaw tensed. "It's none of your business." The man raised an eyebrow. "Seems like you made it everyone's business when you called the cops on a man just trying to eat his breakfast." A flicker of hesitation crossed Evan's face, but it was gone just as quickly. He crossed his arms. "If you don't like it, you can leave too." The older man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Son, I've been coming here since before you were born. Pretty sure I've got more right to be here than you." For the first time, Evan looked unsure. But before he could say anything, the sharp wail of sirens cut through the air. The sound sent a ripple through the diner, forks clinking against plates, whispers picking up speed. Samuel didn't turn to look. He just sat there, waiting as the red and blue lights flashed through the front window. But the moment the officer stepped inside, everything changed. The diner door swung open with force, the little bell above it rattling. 2 officers stepped inside, their boots heavy against the checkered floor, their hands hovered near their belts, scanning the room for what they'd been told was a disturbance. Samuel remained seated, his posture unchanged. He'd been in situations far more dangerous than this. He knew better than to move too fast, to make any sudden gestures. Evan straightened, his voice taking on a rehearsed innocence. "Officers, that's him." He pointed, his polished nails stabbing the air in Samuel's direction. "He refused to leave when I asked him. He's making people uncomfortable." One of the officers, a tall man with a squared jaw, started forward, his stance rigid. His partner, slightly younger, followed a step behind. But as they got closer, something shifted. The older officer's face changed. His jaw loosened, his eyes widened, his brows creasing as if he were seeing a ghost. He stopped mid-step, his breath hitching in his throat. "Sergeant Phillips," his voice carried through the diner, quiet but weighted with something deeper than duty. Samuel finally looked up, his deep-set eyes meeting the officer's face. There was a long pause, one of those moments that stretched, making time feel slow and thick. Then recognition flickered in Samuel's expression. He studied Reyes carefully, memories of dusty roads and distant gunfire surfacing in his mind. "Lieutenant Reyes." His voice was steady, but there was something softer in it now. "Didn't expect to see you here." Evan's confidence cracked, his mouth opened slightly, confusion washing over his face. "Wait, you know him?" His voice had lost its edge, uncertainty creeping in. Reyes ignored him, his hands off his belt now, his posture fully relaxed. He turned to his partner, shaking his head slightly. "Stand down," he instructed, but his gaze remained on Samuel. The younger officer hesitated, glancing between the 2 men, sensing the history woven into the air. "You served together?" he asked cautiously. Reyes nodded. "Fallujah. 2004. This man pulled me out of a burning Humvee, saved my life." His voice carried the weight of the past, a past that neither he nor Samuel could ever fully leave behind.